Imagine walking through the airport, minding your own business, just trying to catch a flight. You've done nothing wrong, just another traveler in the crowd. But suddenly, out of nowhere, a cop singles you out. His tone is sharp, his stance aggressive. You feel the stares of strangers as he demands answers, treating you like a suspect when all you did was exist in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's exactly what happened to one man, and little did this officer know, his actions were about to change everything. At first, it seemed like just another case of overreach, something too many people have experienced but rarely see justice for. The officer, full of authority, thought he had control of the situation. He questioned, he accused, and he made assumptions, never once considering that he might be picking the wrong fight. But what he didn't realize was that this time, things were different. This wasn't just any traveler. This was someone who knew their rights, someone who wasn't afraid to stand up and fight back. And they weren't alone. Within seconds, the power dynamics started to shift. Bystanders pulled out their phones, capturing every moment. The truth was no longer just between them, it was about to be seen by the world. As the officer continued pushing his authority, thinking he could get away with it, he failed to notice one crucial detail, a detail that would make all the difference. And just like that, in a matter of moments, the situation took a turn that no one, especially the officer, expected. The very career he had built was now hanging by a thread. What happened next would send shockwaves far beyond that airport. The officer's voice grew louder, his stance more rigid. He was convinced he had control, that his badge gave him the final say. But the man he was targeting wasn't backing down. He wasn't hostile, he wasn't aggressive, just firm. He knew his rights, and he knew something wasn't right about this situation. People around them could sense it too. A few bystanders started inching closer, their phones still recording. The tension in the air was thick, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. The officer demanded identification, claiming it was standard procedure, but the man calmly responded, asking why he was being stopped. No real answer came, just vague statements about suspicious behavior. That's when something changed. One of the bystanders spoke up. "I saw everything. He didn't do anything." Another person chimed in, "Yeah, why are you harassing him?" Suddenly, the officer wasn't just facing one man. He was facing a crowd that wasn't afraid to question him. His authority, once unquestioned, was slipping. But instead of backing off, he doubled down. He reached for his radio, calling for backup, still convinced he could control the narrative. But what he didn't know was that this entire situation was about to take a turn he never saw coming. Among the bystanders was someone unexpected, someone with influence, someone who wasn't just going to let this slide. This person knew exactly who to call, exactly what steps to take to make sure this moment wouldn't be buried or forgotten. As the officer stood there, still confident he had the upper hand, something shifted in the background. A message was being sent, a call was being made, and within moments, the officer's fate was already being sealed. He just didn't know it yet. The officer's radio crackled as he called for backup, his grip tightening around his belt. His eyes darted between the man in front of him and the growing crowd. He was used to being in control, used to his authority being the final word. But something about this moment felt different. The usual fear he expected wasn't there. Instead, there was resistance, not just from the man he stopped, but from the people around them. The man, still calm, repeated his question. "Why am I being stopped?" His voice didn't waver, but there was an edge to it now. He wasn't just asking for himself, he was asking for everyone watching. The officer hesitated for just a second, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. But then, just as quickly, he pushed forward. "You match the description of a suspect," he said, his voice firm, but there was no real confidence behind it. A murmur spread through the crowd. A woman near the front shook her head. "That's the excuse every time," she muttered, just loud enough for those around her to hear. Another man whispered, "He just walked in like the rest of us. What description is he talking about?" Then, a shift. A man stepped forward, well-dressed, composed, But there was something in his presence that made the officer take notice. "Officer," he said, his voice steady but sharp, "I'd be very careful about what happens next." He wasn't threatening, but his words carried weight. The officer stiffened, his hand hovering near his radio again. Unbeknownst to him, the video of this encounter was already spreading. The person recording had sent it out. Tweets were flying, messages were being shared. And among those watching from afar was someone who had the power to do more than just talk. The officer thought he was just dealing with one man. But what he didn't realize was that this wasn't just an airport stop anymore. This was becoming something much bigger, something that was about to change his life forever. The officer's jaw tightened as he glanced at the growing crowd. His grip on control was slipping, and he knew it. The man he had stopped wasn't backing down, and now others were speaking up too. The murmurs grew louder, the atmosphere shifting from quiet concern to something more urgent. People weren't just watching anymore, they were holding him accountable in real time. Then, another voice cut through the noise. A woman near the back of the crowd held up her phone. "This is live," she said. "Thousands are watching." The officer's expression flickered, just for a second, but he quickly forced himself to stay composed. Still, something had changed. This wasn't just another stop. He could feel it now. This moment was bigger than him. The man he had targeted stood his ground. "So, let me get this straight," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You stopped me with no real reason, and now you're doubling down because people are watching." His words stung, hitting the officer harder than he expected. The cop had been in plenty of situations like this before, but this time, something was different. The pressure was mounting. And then, just as backup arrived, a new player entered the scene. A tall man in a suit pushed through the crowd, his expression unreadable. He didn't look like just another bystander. There was something authoritative about him, something that made even the officer hesitate. He walked straight up to the officer, lowering his voice just enough that only a few could hear. "You have no idea who you just messed with," he said. For the first time, the officer felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had been so certain he was in control. But now, as he looked around, the cameras, the growing crowd, the serious man in front of him, he realized he might have just made the biggest mistake of his career, and the consequences were about to hit faster than he ever could have imagined. The officer's confidence wavered, but he wasn't ready to back down. He squared his shoulders, glancing at the suited man before shifting his gaze back to the crowd. His backup had arrived, 2 other officers stepping in beside him, hands hovering near their belts. But the energy in the room had shifted, and even they could sense it. Then, something unexpected happened. A phone buzzed loudly, followed by another. And another. People in the crowd started whispering, looking down at their screens, eyes widening. The video had spread faster than anyone expected, but now there was something new, a name, a headline, a breaking news alert flashing across social media. One of the bystanders spoke up. Is this the guy from?" He stopped, looking around, realization setting in. Others were catching on too. This wasn't just some random airport traveler. The officer frowned, confusion crossing his face. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice more defensive now. The suited man smirked slightly, shaking his head. "Oh, you really don't know, do you?" He stepped back, glancing at the man who had been stopped, who remained perfectly calm despite the chaos unfolding around him. The weight of the moment was shifting again, but this time, it wasn't in the officer's favor. One of the backup officers took a step back, his radio crackling to life with a new message, something urgent, something he wasn't expecting. His expression changed instantly. He turned to the first officer, lowering his voice. "We have a problem," he muttered. But the first officer wasn't listening. His heartbeat was pounding in his ears, his grip tightening. He had thought he was dealing with just another traveler, but now the pieces were clicking into place. He had miscalculated, badly. And now the mistake he had made wasn't just about this one moment. It was about to unravel everything. The first officer's face went pale as his colleague whispered urgently in his ear. His eyes darted back to the man he had stopped, no longer just a random traveler, but someone far more significant. The suited man crossed his arms, watching the realization sink in. "You really don't know who he is, do you?" he said, shaking his head. The officer swallowed hard. The name flashing across social media, the news alerts flooding in, it all pointed to one thing. This wasn't just any man. He was someone with power, someone with connections. And worst of all, someone who wasn't going to let this moment be swept under the rug. Then, a voice rang out from the crowd. "They're saying he's a federal investigator." A wave of shock rippled through the onlookers. The officer's stomach dropped. He had spent his whole career assuming authority meant control, that his word was final. But now the tables had turned in the worst possible way. The man he had targeted finally spoke again, his voice just as steady as before. "So, officer," he said, tilting his head slightly, "am I still suspicious, or are you starting to regret this decision?" The officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. His backup had already taken a step away from him, unwilling to be dragged down with him. The suited man pulled out his phone. "I'd suggest you get a lawyer," he said casually, "because this is going to be a problem for you." The officer's radio crackled again, this time with a direct order. "Stand down. Now." And just like that, it was over. His career, his reputation, everything he had built, was crumbling right in front of him. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, but in a matter of minutes, he had become the very thing he feared most, exposed. The officer stood frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The badge on his chest, once a symbol of authority, now felt like a burden. The crowd remained silent for a beat, as if everyone was absorbing what had just happened. Then murmurs spread, some shaking their heads, others whispering about how quickly things had unraveled. The man he had stopped took one last look at him before turning to the suited figure. "Let's go," he said calmly, as if this was just another day. No anger, no need to shout, just quiet confidence, knowing the damage was already done. He didn't need revenge. The truth had done the work for him. The backup officers hesitated, then exchanged glances before stepping aside, distancing themselves from the unfolding fallout. The first officer's radio crackled once more, but this time he didn't reach for it. He knew. The decision had already been made. As the man walked away, the suited figure glanced back. "You'll be hearing from people very soon," he said, slipping his phone into his pocket. "And I'd start thinking about what you'll say when they call." The officer's breath was shaky now. He had spent years thinking he was in control, but now his future was out of his hands. As the crowd slowly dispersed, the videos continued spreading, gaining more views by the second. For the officer, this moment wouldn't just disappear, it would follow him, a reminder that power is never absolute. And for the man who stood his ground, it was proof that sometimes just knowing your rights and refusing to be silenced is enough to change everything.